Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this Balanced Scorecard Institute webinar. Today, we're going to talk about the formal steps to strategic planning within the context of a major disruption. We're also going to talk about how to frame all of those important conversations that you're having right now about your strategy and recent events and in a more disciplined manner using basic planning principles. I'm David Wilsey, Chief Operating Officer at the Balanced Scorecard Institute. I've been teaching or consulting on balanced scorecard, performance measurement, or strategic planning related topics for 15 years or so. I'm normally working out of our Balanced Scorecard Institute headquarters in Cary, North Carolina in the United States. Today, I'm working from home, as I assume most of you are. So I apologize in advance if my kids interrupt or if the internet locks up because they're streaming Frozen 2 for the 47th time or something along those lines. So let me turn off the camera. Nobody wants to look at that for an hour. And let's get started. All right, so here's what I look like without my full virus beard. Thank you all again for attending. I noticed that we had almost 1,100 people register for this event. So clearly there are a lot of you sitting at home with nothing else better to do. As you all know, or most of you know, I think, we do these webinars as part of our regular promotions for our Balanced Scorecard Professional Certification programs. We've been offering this program in association with the George Washington University Center for Excellence in Public Leadership since 2006. What you might not know is that we're now offering this program as a live online course. So anyone that attends this webinar will be entitled to a discount for a Balanced Scorecard Bootcamp, whether it's online or in person in the US before the end of May. Just use the discount code BSC webinar without the quotes on your registration form, or just reach out to us directly. And before I get too far along, I'd like to clarify the purpose of the webinar, and I want to be clear about what this webinar does not cover. I don't want to pretend that we're here to help you with the fundamental priorities in your life right now, like health and safety and social distancing and emergency response. We're not going to address operational resource management, resource planning issues, like HR planning or financial planning that you're probably dealing with right now. And most importantly, we can't help you find toilet paper. So if we can't help you with these specific, narrow solutions, what are we here to help you with? What we are here to help you with is to frame the conversations that you're having. Make sure that you're thinking about things in a disciplined manner using basic planning principles. Especially if you're new to this, new to planning, you'll benefit from reviewing the formal principles and the basic steps to strategic planning and how those principles are applied within the context of a major disruption like this, like the COVID-19 situation. So who knew that this little guy could cause so much trouble? Our entire world has been turned upside down over the last month or so. Now, if you work in the strategy world, this is the point that you realize that just how much of your strategy is based on assumptions. I know, and I also know this is the point that the consultants all start pulling out their favorite Darwin cliches. But the fact of the matter is that if your strategy is based on assumptions that are no longer true, you have to adapt. That's what this is about. This is about adapting to a whole new world. So everybody stop for a minute and think about your strategy. When you formulated your strategy, did you assume that the economy would be fundamentally stable, for instance? Did you assume that your customers would have the money to buy your products, or that the tax revenue would be coming in the same way? Did you assume that your customers or stakeholders could gather in person, or that they could travel? If you're a restaurant, did you assume that people could be in the same room at the same time? If you're like us and you do training, did you assume that people could travel to a city and take a training class all in the room, same in the room with each other? Did you assume your employees could do those things? Did you assume that your employees could travel? Could our consultants travel to the client site? If you have employees that are parents, are you assuming that they can work all day while their kids are in school? Because I can tell you, it's not happening right this second. There's a lot of complications that are happening for all the parents out there. Did you assume that your supply chain is uninterrupted? I've heard a lot of stories in the news and talked to clients that maybe they're manufacturing something, and there are key resources that they can't get right now. There's they can't do what they normally do because of the supply chain. Um, are you assuming that your employees would remain healthy? There are stories in the news that some companies, in New York, are losing 10 to 20% of their employees. Or they're out sick. So is there a continuity issue because of the health of your employees, or maybe it's just key leaders? Is there anything else? So let's take a second. Everybody open the question and answer box again. Um, are there any additional assumptions that we might need to revisit, that you might need to revisit? Maybe one of the things that I've already listed is really important for your strategy. So everybody open the Q&A um, box and write your assumptions as in the form of a question. What challenges, somebody already asked, what challenges are you dealing with? What assumptions do you need to revisit? Do people want to spend money on social memberships? Okay, so somebody's organization relies on social membership. That's an important element. Political and economic stability. That's a good one. I'm guessing that affects most of us. Will people travel as they did before? Okay, so there's a long-term consequence to this, perhaps. Some of you might not be able to have the same business model you did before if people decide they don't want to go back to the normal world of traveling the way they did. Just the basic uncertainty about how long this will last. Remote work policies, that might be an issue for many of you. We've got employees all working from home. They're not used to doing this. Workload levels, alignment. We need to revisit all of these assumptions. It's a good one. It's exactly right. Government funding, is it going to be constant? Are people cutting back on training budgets? Do they need to revisit their strategic objectives? Stability in exchange rates. Wow. I mean, see, this is almost a never-ending list. The disruption is causing so many of our assumptions to be challenged that I could sit here for a half an hour reading these, it looks like. Okay, so the takeaway here is that you really do have to think through any basic assumption that your business model or your organizational strategy is based upon. Okay, so that's a key takeaway of this whole exercise, is that you have to revisit all those assumptions. Okay, so before we get to the particulars of resetting your strategy during a crisis, let's talk through the basic steps of planning in general. So planning is very much a process. And so like any other process, it can be mapped out as a series of steps, and it can be improved over time. So here's the framework that we have used with hundreds of organizations in over 40 countries. It's called the 9 Steps to Success. Everything I show you will be based on this framework, but frankly, the basic underlying planning principles are common to lots of frameworks. I like to emphasize that the point here is to apply a certain amount of discipline to the process of articulating what you're trying to accomplish, and then making it happen. For teaching purposes, I think it's easier to look at the steps in a more linear fashion. So before you get started, it's useful to take a step back and plan the planning effort itself. This is where you will want to think through who needs to be involved, the logistics, how do you plan to manage the change, and all the other things that you have to address to make this happen successfully. Then the formal planning process begins. The first 6 steps of our methodology are a linear path to creating what we refer to as a balanced strategic plan. The beginning of any planning methodology begins with the assessment of the current strategic environment. What is our internal and external context for our strategy? Can we establish a consensus around on what our team thinks are, where things currently stand? Based on what we find in our assessment, we formulate strategy in step 2. We think about what our customers need, and we create a value proposition. How have those needs changed based on what's going on in the world? We adapt. We consider various possible scenarios for the future that we should plan for. High-level goals or focus areas are established. We establish consensus around essentially what success would look like. Then some planning methodologies stop there with goals and strategies. But in the balanced scorecard world, we think that it is just as important to marry planning with execution. So it doesn't make any sense to identify goals if you can't get your employees to make it happen. So the rest of the planning process overlaps with the beginnings of strategy execution. First, we have to break the strategic goals down into actionable steps in step 3. The objectives we identify in step 3 are mapped out visually in step 4. This enables us to tell a simple story about how our strategy works. Then in step 5, we define measures of success, as well as the targets that identify the level of performance we're aiming for. And in step 6, we identify and prioritize the actions we plan to implement in order to improve performance. So after those linear 6 steps, we have a balanced strategic plan at the organizational level. There are more ongoing strategy execution steps later. And we cover those in more detail in other courses and other webinars. But at a very high level, the first strategy has to be to communicate, what we're trying to communicate our strategy in sort of a rollout phase. Then performance is analyzed and adapted in step 7. In step 8, the formal process of cascading happens to create alignment throughout the organization. And then in step 9, we evaluate and revise the entire process. You'll notice that these strategy execution steps are more ongoing rather than a linear process like the first 6 steps. I think it's important to note that all of these steps are built around basic planning principles. What that means is that they're adaptable to different types or different sizes of organizations or different situations like this pandemic disruption. So if I'm creating a formal strategic plan for a $500 billion company or maybe a government agency, the details will look different than if I'm a small 2-person business running out of my garage. But the principles will be the same, and the basic process will be the same. All of us will assess our environment. We will formulate a strategy that articulates what we're trying to accomplish. We'll break the strategy down into steps. We'll visualize strategy. We'll measure success, and we'll prioritize action. I even know people that use these same principles to plan their personal life. It's the same concept. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about how to adapt these principles to a major disruption and see what some of those details might look like. And actually, before we do that, let's do our first poll. I'd like to have a better idea. I'm going to launch the poll, and then I'll tell you. I'll see if I can get this to work. I'd like to have a better idea of if you're using a formal process for strategic planning. Okay, so you should see the questions now. Yeah, are there? I know some of you are using the 9 steps. I'm guessing that some of you are using other frameworks, and I'm guessing that some of you use different elements of planning without the larger structure. Oh, and then I'm guessing some of you are in learning mode. This is all new. All right, so we've got about 30 more seconds. I've got about almost 70% of you have voted, and then I'll show you the results. Okay, a few more people trickling in. Let's do 5 more seconds. All right, now I'm sharing the results. So it looks like 20% of you used the 9 steps. That's fantastic. 27% of you are doing similar activities, only using a different framework. And then 44% of you are using some of the pieces. You know, maybe we have a mission statement, we have a vision statement, we've done SWOT analysis, we've probably created some goals, but maybe it's not quite as organized as some of the materials I'm showing you. And then 10% of you are just getting started. Okay, it's very interesting. All right, so let's keep going and see what this would look like. First of all, let's talk about the basic principles of planning during a disruption. Before we get back to the mechanics, let's talk through some of the basic differences between day-to-day planning and the planning you do during a crisis level disruption. This really is a black swan type of event, as they say. I've seen a lot of people on LinkedIn talking about. This is a black swan is one of these very unusual outlier kinds of an event. So how does that affect our basic approach to strategy? First of all, just to re-emphasize, again, the same point, is that you have to be ready to challenge even the most basic of assumptions and then adapt. Secondly, you want to be able to move quickly. This means accepting the fact that the plan will not be perfect. An 80% solution created over days is much better than a 90% solution created over 6 months, for instance. Now, we like to stress that even when you're not in the middle of a pandemic, but especially in a point of crisis, you have to be able to move on and don't try to make things perfect. Try not to panic. And trust the process. I know that's easier said than done, especially for those of you that are out there that are really on the brink of disaster. But take a breath, trust the process. You'll at least get to a better place if you let the discipline of the process guide you. Don't forget that the internet is a beautiful thing. I am always surprised by how many people forget that and they try to launch a new, say, work from home strategy without stopping for 15 minutes to see what recommendations the rest of the world has. There's almost never a reason to reinvent the wheel. So even if you end up rejecting what everyone else is doing, that perspective will be helpful. Planning during a major disruption requires a more agile mind frame. One of the other co-authors of the Institute Way, Dan Montgomery, has written extensively about this. He likes to say that that you have to learn to embrace uncertainty. 3 or 4 months ago, no one could have predicted what we're going through right now, and don't expect the future to be any more predictable. That means that you have to be able to adapt on the fly with new strategies, new objectives, new measures, and new initiatives each time the world changes. Dan and some of the other OKR folks like Felipe Castro and others, they talk a lot about speeding up the action learning cadence. In other words, you can't create a 5-year strategic plan and some annual KPIs and then just forget about it. You need a regular review cadence where you try to determine what's working and what is not. You test new initiatives, you monitor performance. If the initiatives aren't working, you move on to the next idea. This cadence should be happening on a monthly or quarterly basis, not annually. Um, it's also easier in that sense for employees to adapt when the focus is on outcomes rather than activities. Um, if you tell your employees, for instance, that our desired outcome is that clients are using our services online, and then a particular initiative goes wrong, say we have an online tool we choose and it doesn't work. Well, employees know they can adapt using a different tool. But if our goal was to implement a tool and things go wrong, people don't feel as empowered to adapt to a brand new goal. So the focus of the goal of the strategy should be on outcomes, not necessarily the actions. For some planning folks that I've worked with, the hardest thing to do is to give up on the strategy that they created. They get married to the outcome, or the output of their own process. And so even if it's clearly not working, they just dig in instead of adapting. So we all have to accept the fact that many of our strategies and many of our improvement ideas are simply not going to work. And so you have to be able to adapt and you have to be able to move on to the next idea. So we're going to spend most of the rest of our time looking at step 1 and 2 of our process because those are the steps that will change the most due to the disruption. So in step 1, we're trying to answer a few fundamental questions. Starting with the one that I know you're all wrestling with right now. What does this disruption mean for us relative to our mission, our vision, our strategy? If I'm in the healthcare world, it's very different than if I'm in the fast food world or if I'm in the insurance industry. Everybody on this call has a slightly different scenario that they have to wrestle with. So what kind of assumptions did you highlight earlier that need to be revisited? And then all these tools that we use. Sometimes when you do a SWOT analysis, like the picture on the right side of the screen, it can almost feel like this mundane conversation as you list out the typical threats and weaknesses that you have to address day in and day out. But during a crisis, threats and weaknesses take on a much different tone, and how you react can have serious consequences. So in step 1, we're trying to assess the internal and external context for our strategy formulation decisions. We have a lot of tools that we use, a lot of tools that we teach in our classes. Most of these you can just look up on the internet. The point of all of them at this point in the game is to better understand what's happening around us so that we can make better positioning decisions in step 2, better strategy decisions. So at the end of step 1, we are trying to establish a consensus around what factors are affecting our organization. We also want to have a better understanding of the risk involved for your organization. I think it's helpful to think of this in terms, 'cause the parallel with personal risk. Right now there are folks who are at high risk of losing their lives. They're taking this more seriously than others who might maybe they're fearing losing their jobs, and then there are a fortunate few who have a relatively low risk of either in a personal basis. And so for the most part this whole experience has been more of an inconvenience. You can think of your organization along this sort of the same type of scale. Some organizations have already shut down, and some of them are toughing it out for the next few months. And then there's a few lucky organizations that have a relatively low risk, or they might even be doing better. Like Zoom, I understand, is doing really well right now, for instance. So this conversation of making sure that we have some context of where we stand on that kind of a scale can be useful. If you really want to dig in on this conversation, it might be useful to facilitate this as a classification and scoring exercise using a probability impact matrix. Now, this is a tool we use anytime we want to help a team better qualify risk, whether we're analyzing risk at the strategy level or at a project level. Essentially, this is about scoring the probability of an event occurring against the expected impact of it occurring. So, an event that is very likely to occur and that is liable to shut down the organization would show up in the upper right hand corner. And obviously, we would take that much more seriously than if it shows up in one of the other quadrants. All right, let's try another poll. This is I'm curious how this is impacting you all. Let me get it started. We're going to simplify the scoring a little bit. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you classify the pandemic risk for your organization? So obviously, if you are scoring yourself on a 1 or 2, you're saying that you're almost certainly expect that this might be the end of your organization. If you score yourself 9 or 10, you're saying that you will most certainly endure. We have some government clients, I think, that fit in that category. Okay, we're up to 60% of you, almost 70% of you have voted now. Very interesting. All right, we're over 75%, maybe about another 5 more seconds. Okay, let me share the results. So 3% of you are actually, 3% and then 2%, 3%. The people that feel like they're in just dire shape, that's a pretty low percentage of the people that are on this webinar. We have 27% at the other extreme, though, that you either work for a government or you work for a company that's doing well right now. For you sell Zoom type related products or something that's doing well right now, and then obviously everybody else falls somewhere in between. It's interesting to see how much variety there is, though. On a scale of 1 to 10, we really have a little bit of everybody on the call. All right, so in step 2, we develop a strategy that builds off the assessment conversation. We have a whole new set of questions we answer, such as, um, what are the various scenarios we need to consider? Scenario planning is a tool we utilize much more heavily during a crisis than we might otherwise. What do our customers need? And what is our value proposition for them? This is the point that strategy really starts to take shape as we think through what needs we should address, and how do we adapt to new needs that the customers might have. What results or goals are we trying to achieve? These are the high level focus areas that the rest of the strategy details will be organized around. Then, if there's a strategy reset in the middle of a crisis, and if the distribution drives the need for a whole new theme or goal, what does success look like for that particular theme or goal? I'll show you a couple examples here in a minute. Or perhaps instead of creating a whole new theme or goal, maybe that sometimes the solution is to adapt one of your existing strategies. Maybe you have an operational excellence theme, and that needs to be adapted. For instance, if the disruption is influencing various components of that strategy, what changes? What changes about how success is defined for that particular strategy? I mentioned that scenario planning is a tool in our toolbox that we will spend some extra time on during a crisis. It's a tool for mapping out possible scenarios so that the team can think through the ramifications of different decisions. It is not a perfect tool by any stretch of the imagination, but as one can predict, as no one can predict the future, But the idea is to imagine different outcomes and then think through the wisest course of action based on that conversation. You might note that scenario planning is not the same as forecasting. Forecasting is about imagining a particular outcome and then allowing for a certain amount of variation. Scenario analysis involves actually imagining completely different outcomes. One of the temptations here is to imagine a high, medium, low set of scenarios. Maybe the economy tanks, the economy flourishes, and then the Goldilocks medium outcome. But that's not really what we mean either. Economic collapse might be a scenario, but everyone getting sick might be a different scenario. And then having so much work we can't handle it might be a scenario. So let's make sure our decision makers have at least entertained these possibilities and created contingencies for those that might realistically happen. By the end of step two, you will want to have identified 3 or 4 themes or goals, which are the focus areas of our strategy. Some common generic examples are on the screen, like the operational excellence, strategic partnering, or build the business themes. For each theme, you'll define the desired result that you're trying to achieve. So let's see what these might look like in a crisis. So here's a couple of examples that you all might be pondering right now. The first is a business continuity theme. So the result of this continuity theme, this is a scenario where you're worried that you don't have the right employees to continue to meet the demands of your customers. Maybe working from home is not working. Maybe people are sick. There's all kinds of reasons why there might be a continuity issue. So the result we're aiming for is that all employees and other stakeholders have the technology infrastructure, cross training, and cultural support to productively deliver a consistent level of quality services from home. That's what we're aiming for. Now, this is the result we're trying to achieve. There will be objectives and measurements and initiatives and a map, all those other pieces that are going to be used to implement that particular strategy. But this is what the theme is and what the result would look like. Another example is online services. And this is very similar to our situation at the Balanced Scorecard Institute. We have, we have to be creating online services. So a potential strategic result might be that our training and consulting clients engage our products and services through a diverse set of online offerings. It's very simple. It's a it's it's our goal that will um, help guide us when we're creating our objectives, our measures, and our initiatives. So whatever themes and results you choose, you will fill in the details over the next few steps. Like I said, there's going to be objectives, measures, and initiatives for each new theme. So I said earlier that some models stop after the team creates goals and strategies. Again, in balanced scorecard world, we want to turn that basic strategy into a system so that we can be sure that the strategy gets executed. So now let's talk very briefly about what I mean by a strategic management system. So let's start with the basic definition. What do I mean by a strategic management system? So now we're veering into our balanced scorecard basics material. What we're talking about here is a framework for managing organizational strategy and strategy execution. We use the framework to communicate to employees and other stakeholders what we're trying to accomplish, to align and coordinate the work that people do with strategy, to prioritize your work, whether you're talking about programs, projects, services, resources, anything that needs to be prioritized. And then we use the framework to measure and improve performance. So during a crisis, you need to communicate what your new strategy is. You need to get everyone on the same page, on the same direction. You need to prioritize action to change direction, towards the new goals. And then you need to use measures to inform you about whether you're making it happen or not? Are you successful? So the system enables us to collectively organize our thoughts. All right, let's try another poll. All right, so this one's similar to the last one. Does your organization use a framework for strategy management that includes measures? So now we're emphasizing the measures element. Uh, measuring performance is important. You need to know, you need measures to help you understand whether your strategy is working or not. Are your initiatives effective or not? Are you getting anything done? Are people focusing on the right things? Okay, so the answers are very similar to last time. Yes, we use the 9 steps method. We use another method. We do have measures, but they're not necessarily connected to strategy, or no, we don't really use measures in a formal sense. And we're almost up to 70% of you voting. I'll just give it a few more seconds. All right, looks like we slowed down. So here's the results. So there are 36% of you that are using another framework, but we are using measures. That's good. And we have our same old 21% using the 9 step method for both the last question and this question. We have measures, but we don't necessarily connect them to anything at 32%. And then we have 13% of you, again, still in learning mode. All right, very good. All right, so a strategy management system connects the dots across several key strategy components. First, high level strategy elements such as mission and vision and your goals, those things provide context for everything else. Then, high level strategy is broken down into a set of objectives. Those objectives are laid out in the form of a strategy map, which visualizes how organizations create value. How does the strategy work? Then measures are used to track organizational performance, and targets are set which define the desired level of performance that we're aiming for. And then finally, strategic initiatives are the projects that are designed and implemented to help you reach your targets and achieve your objectives. So if you are urgently trying to get your team to implement a new continuity strategy, the discipline of this system will help you focus on strategy and improve performance. So this is what a plan looks like in real life. It's this is an example based on an organizational level balance scorecard. It's for a generic city. It's based on a city government we worked with, but the pieces look roughly the same as any other. At the top, you can see the high level mission and vision and strategy for this city. This is how they communicate their picture of the future, their purpose, and the 3 or 4 high level focus areas of their strategy. Then on the left side of the screen, you can see the objectives and the strategy map that they use to communicate with. This strategy tells a cause and effect story of how the city government creates value. It creates context for everything else within the system. In the middle part of the screen, you can see their measures and their targets. So if you have good measures, they can help your organization. They can help you make sure that your employees are focusing their attention on what's really important. They also, like I've said a couple of times, they give you an objective way to understand whether your strategy is working or not. And then on the right side of their screen, you can see the strategic initiatives that the organization is implementing in order to achieve objectives. To This is created through a prioritization process. So they maybe they brainstorm initiatives at one point, but the prioritization process gets you to a short list of ideas that will make the biggest improvement for the organization. So now that you've seen how the basic pieces of the system work, Let's look at something you might create in response to this crisis. So earlier I showed you a strategic theme based on online services. So let's see what the objectives, the strategy map, the measures, and the initiatives might look like for a strategy like that. Okay, so in the bottom part of my screen here, you'll see a couple of objectives related to the capacities we need to build. Okay, so we need to improve our online infrastructure. Maybe we need to get our facilitators better skills in online facilitation, because it's not exactly the same to facilitate online as it is in person. So we'll set up an objective, measures, and such around that. We think that if we do those two things, it will enable us to deliver better online services. So we'll improve that. Meanwhile, we have another group of people that are focusing on marketing analysis and improving the marketing, because maybe the marketing related to online services is different than our in-person services. Our better online services could drive better customer satisfaction, and that plus the marketing hopefully will help us improve online participation, which will lead to better revenue, more revenue. Maybe the online services can help us lower our costs, ultimately driving profitability. The point is I use this picture to tell a story. I use it to communicate with my employees what's important. I use it to help them focus on the most important things. I use them to create my performance measures, which might be related to revenue or to online participation or to social media traffic related to my online service marketing. Or maybe I have a measurement around my facilitators. The point, having the right skills. The point is that I need to measure my progress on all of these objectives. Then I might have some initiatives, the actions that I'm taking. We need to redesign our services. We need to create a marketing campaign. We need to upgrade our infrastructure. So these are the actions that we would take to make this strategy work. So this is an example for the new online services strategy. If your strategy were business continuity, you'd have capabilities that you would need to build, driving process improvements, which you would need to make, which would drive customer and financial related desired outcomes. Your measures and initiatives would reflect that strategy. And the point is that you would have a system to tie everything together and to communicate with. Now, I know some people will say this, oh, this looks like common sense. And yet, my experience has been that those are the same folks that when we first start developing one of these with their team, that they're always surprised at how disjointed their team is in terms of understanding what it is that they're trying to do. And also making it look like common sense is actually a lot of work. So if it does look like common sense, you're probably on the right track. We got a few questions beforehand. One of them was from Sammy in Ottawa. He asked us about prioritizing initiatives in advance of the webinar. I know a lot of our clients have been worried about this, and I think it's an activity that most of you are doing, even if you are doing it on the back of a napkin. Um, you have a list of initiatives that you've been implementing. Now this crisis happens. You need a disciplined process for stopping some of your existing initiatives and then implementing a new set of initiatives. So how do you go about that? So let's start with a crash course on our approach to prioritization. This is a process that we follow where we take all of the initiative ideas that come up during the planning process or that are already in place, and we use a filtering process to get to one of to get to the ones that should be implemented. We typically use a scoring criteria system or maybe even simple voting to prioritize, but there's a few other methods we use as well. We use a 2 by 2 matrix process, and there's something called paired comparison. The point here is that if you have done this exercise in the past, you are certainly going to need to go through that exercise again now. There are a lot of ways to do this. You could introduce a new criterion related to the disruption, or maybe change the weighting to favor the initiatives that help you get through the disruption. Or I think most commonly, you could simply filter all of your initiatives into 2 buckets. one for initiatives that are on hold until after things go back to normal, and one for newly prioritized initiatives that are moving to the top of the list for the time being. Again, the point is to use a disciplined process to establish consensus across the team around the choices that you're making. Okay, so to wind things down, strategic planning is pretty simple if you impose a bit of discipline and follow basic planning principles. During a crisis, the details and the agility of how you approach things might change, and the ramifications for not planning will be significantly more severe. But the basic approach you use will stay roughly the same. Okay, so before I open the floor for questions, let me run through our promotional stuff quickly, if you don't mind. Um, if you'd like to learn more, our Balanced Scorecard Professional Certification Program is now available in a live online format. The first program starts in May, just a couple weeks. Um, for more information, visit balancescorecard.org/BSP-online, as you see on the screen. Whoops, sorry about that. And then some of you might be thinking, wow, we need to maybe get some help here, and we don't have time to wait for one of us to get trained. In that case, feel free to reach out to us and schedule a 30-minute free advisory consulting session. We'll talk through your strategy a bit. We'll see if there might be some way we can help you. So just email info@strategymanage.com for that. All right, finally, we have one more poll. And this again is related to the promotional stuff that we just showed you. If there's any chance that you might be interested in learning more about this, and you would like for one of us to reach out to us, reach out to you, just let us know which service you might be interested in, whether it's training, whether it's consulting, or maybe it's both. And we'll be happy to have one of our team members reach out to you. And of course, if you'd rather us just leave you alone, we're happy to do that as well. All right, so we were up to a little over 50%. I'll give you another 5 or 10 seconds, and then we'll move on to questions. All right, I think we'll stop there. I think a few people are dropped off when you move into the promotional stuff. So, okay, so well, not even quite half of you said no, no thank you. That's good to hear. So several of you are interested in the training. Got a few people interested in the consulting, and then a few people interested in both. Well, thank you very much for letting us know. That simplifies our process a little bit. All right, so we're almost out of time, but we do have some time to take a few questions before I lose you all. If you could, please open the Q&A, the question and answer panel on your Zoom interface. Like I said earlier, I already had some questions come in beforehand, and so I'll try to get to those. Usually when we have 1,100 participants, we have hundreds of questions that come rolling in all at the same time. So we won't get to all of them, but if you want to, if we don't get to your question, just reach out to us via email, and we'll, we're happy to talk through it, whatever you're wrestling with. And we almost always get a lot of questions about the availability of the slides and the replay. We will post a replay of this presentation in the next day or so. And we will send you a notice so you'll know that it's there, so you'll have access to the content in that section, in that sense. Okay, I see a question about vision. Why isn't vision in the 9 steps? It is. Vision, we do vision statements and mission statements during step 1. Frankly, in a 1-hour webinar, we don't get to every single sub-step. So there are some details to the process that I didn't quite get to. But vision is obviously a very important component of step 1, where we make sure we articulate that before we move on to the other stuff. All right, can planning be done virtually? We have a few questions about that. That's obviously an obvious point of concern right now. And the answer is yes. I don't think virtual meetings will ever quite replace a live meeting, but if you use cameras and have a skilled facilitator, then you can come pretty close. We've done this a few times and have found that for organizations that are already comfortable with the technology, it goes really well. For organizations that the technology is a challenge, it's obviously a little harder. I think that might be changing now that we're all sort of forced to take a crash course in online meetings. Everybody's getting up to speed really fast. But we have a tool called Miro, M-I-R-O, Miro, that we use it replicates the flip charts and the post-it notes and all that. If you've ever been in one of our live sessions, we use a lot of flip charts, a lot of post-it notes. And so this tool replicates that experience. And so it works pretty well. We see a lot of questions about the book, the videos. You know, if you're our book, the Institute Way is about the basic process of strategic planning using a balanced scorecard. There might be a little bit here and there about disruption, but it was obviously written uh, before this happened, and so it's much more of a mainstream strategic planning book rather than a book that specifically addresses disruption. Now, I did have another question about what should we be reading? Reading about during disruption. Back in the day, like 3 or 4 months ago, uh, if somebody asked me about disruption and what book they should be reading, I would have gone to the classics. Blue Ocean Strategy is about creating disruption to a certain extent. The Innovator's Dilemma is about disruption, mapping innovation. But that doesn't really get at the situation today exactly. Those are more like your traditional disruption kind of a thing. And then I've seen a lot of people talking about the book, The Black Swan. Um, Highly improbable outlier type occurrences is a black swan. But in the strategy world, if you think if you're thinking you're going to be able to predict a black swan type occurrence, and I think you're probably going to get yourself in trouble. So I would probably stick with the strategy books. The I already mentioned Dan Montgomery. His book "Start Less, Finish More" is a good book if you want to think more in terms of agile thinking. What's the difference between an objective and a measure? An objective captures the continuous improvement activity that we're trying to implement to make things happen. It's more qualitative in nature. The measurement is literally what we're counting. Okay, the target is the desired level of performance. So, as an example, I might want to communicate that we want to improve the customer experience. That's my objective. It keeps my eye on the big picture. And then as a measurement, I'm going to use our customer satisfaction survey score. And the measurement I'm counting that, it's important. But really, what I want to know is, am I improving the customer experience? That's really the key. The higher level thing is the objective. Okay, got some questions about change management. How do you get people on board? That's another good question. Again, I didn't talk an awful lot today about change management. That's normally one of our standard parts of our repertoire because the challenge of strategic planning is almost never about the strategy itself, right? The challenge is almost always about getting people to make it happen. So our whole approach is built around change management principles. For example, people are more likely to buy into strategy if they're involved if they're involved in the development of strategy. So we to have a very inclusive approach to strategy development in a systematic sense. We also build in a lot of communications planning where we map out the various stakeholders involved and help the client figure out the best approach to communicating with stakeholders, et cetera. Anyway, so there's a lot of change management elements involved, but the point is that you really have to have you have to have an intentional approach to change if you want this to be successful. Again, a lot of questions about the replay. That'll be um, The replay will be posted in the next couple of days. Can you integrate? How can you integrate between balanced scorecard and blue ocean strategy? That's a great question. When we get to the strategy step, step 2, again, I glossed over a lot of the details. We do, I mentioned customer value proposition. About that same time, we use a lot of the blue ocean tools to help formulate a strategy that's going to be successful. Blue ocean is really good for helping the team better understand, whether they're in a highly competitive market, let's just say, or if they're really doing something that's if they're really doing something that's going to change their market, move into this blue ocean. So we use several of the blue ocean tools to help frame our strategy conversation. Okay, we have a couple questions about the structure of the online training. Our live program is normally a 5-day boot camp. We have basically translated that 5-day live experience into 10 online sessions. Each session's about an hour of lecture and then about 90 minutes of exercise. The lecture will be very much like this webinar in format. We've got slides, we've got a talking face, we've got poll questions, things like that. Then the participants will break into small teams and move over to that Miro application I mentioned. And so you'll have 4 or 5 people on a team. There'll be a facilitator, and the facilitator will help the team work through all the exercises. For example, they'll be in Miro. They might develop a strategy map using a Miro virtual flip chart. The first 6 steps of the strategic planning process is a balanced strategic plan. What are the last 3 steps referred to? It's a great question, Irene. What I was saying is the output of the first 6 steps is the balanced strategic plan. The last 3 steps are more about strategy execution, strategy implementation. We don't have a single defining output of the last 3 steps the way we do the plan. Can you share all the assumptions that you received from participants we didn't consider in our planning? We can see if we can take everyone's names off it and send out the assumptions. I think that'd be fantastic. I'm guessing everybody would benefit from that. Okay, I see a couple questions. Can you apply the 9 steps in a small company, less than 20 people? We always get a lot of questions like that. And we have worked with an office with as small as 7 employees. It was still just as useful to be able to articulate what you're trying to accomplish. And obviously the meetings were a little simpler. You didn't have to do so much to communicate to so many people, but a small team can certainly benefit from this kind of conversation. And it's just as adaptable to a massively large organization as well. We've worked with organizations that were all over the world, and that there were communications to that, or complications to that, in a communication sense. But again, the principles and the process are the same, no matter what size or what type of organization you have. How do you convince the owner of a business to stop and make a strategic plan? That's a fantastic question. It's one of the biggest challenges, is to make sure that you win people over. I would say you need to prove that there's value in it. It's going to be convincing, and you better make sure you get the owner or the leader on board, because everybody's going to figure out if the leadership is not on board, and you're trying to do this without their support. It's going to be much harder. But this is a proof of concept exercise, where if you can prove that measurement is valuable, that's pretty easy to prove usually. We all use measurement when we exercise. We use it when we play sports. I think it's intuitive that measurement is valuable. Articulating what you're trying to accomplish and planning. I mean, surely most people will not argue with the idea that you should organize your thoughts, plan. So I would think through some of the benefits that the business will get if you are a little more organized about the way you the way you the way you plan. How does OKR compare to balanced scorecard? Oh, we're going to run out. We're about out of time, so maybe this will be the last question. OKR, that stands for objectives and key results. It's a framework that is based on the thinking that went back into back in the management by objectives. It goes way back to many decades ago. It's very popular today, primarily because Google used it, and basically when Google uses something, everybody knows about it. It's very similar to what we do in the world of balanced scorecard. It's about articulating what you're trying to accomplish in an objective sense, and the key results are the measurable components. The way it's structured is a little different than a balanced scorecard. It tends to be something that you create on an individual basis rather than on an organizational basis first. But then a lot of the OKR folks build them out very similar to the way we do this. So there's not a rhyme or reason to it. The argument I think that the OKR world would say that they like their methodology is because they think that it's more agile. It tends to be something that you can adapt on the fly over time. From period to period. If you do have a crisis like this and you need to adjust your strategy, you can very quickly have everybody recast their OKRs based on the new strategy. And frankly, we have found that balanced scorecard can be implemented in that same manner. We really like the idea of having a shared scorecard, a shared strategy, a shared set of goals, a shared set of objectives at the organization level first. And many of the OKR companies don't necessarily have that. They tend to build them at the individual level and just sort of let people go with that. Anyway, if you want to know more about OKRs, there's a white paper on our website that we can share with you. It talks about using it with balanced scorecard as well. Anyway, so I think we're out of time. So I think that'll do it for today. If you would like to learn more about balanced scorecard or strategic planning or anything related to this topic, please visit our website at balancedScorecard.org. You can buy our book called The Institute Way, or you can contact us. Find the Contact Us page to reach out to us directly. If I didn't get to your question, I'd be happy to correspond via email. Thank you all very much for attending, and please, everyone, stay safe.